In the Syrian city of Raqqa, Islamic State is making a final stand. Fighting them, a fragile coalition. Of powers, great and small, of Arabs and Kurds, of men and women. We've just driven down these narrow side streets, and suddenly there's gunfire overhead. The enemy they face has weaponized fear. But this is more than the final showdown with ISIS in its capital. It's also a battle for a Kurdish state in northern Syria.
It's something bigger than me. It's for people here, it's for women here, and for women all in the Middle East, and even maybe potentially the world.
It's a fight for territory, both physical and ideological. This story begins not in Raqqa, but in Kobani. What remains of this largely Kurdish city stands as a monument to a brutal turning point in the war against Islamic State. It was here that IS reached its high watermark, its territory extending as far as the Turkish border. It was here it met its first significant defeat.
يعني الشعر داسبيكي الشعر داعش شعر بسيكولوجيكي بترس إنسان تخوزي إنسان تسليم بقري شخو خاطنا داعش داسبيكي كوندورا داسبيكر كوندورا تشتي خوي كوهيز جديد تانغ بون أو دبابة بون وجلي خوي راش بون يعني ما قلت همنا التجربة ما ملي شري دربة ذهبوا نا شري باجران ذهبوا.
The cemetery in Kobani testifies to just how high a price Kurdish fighters, men and women, have already paid in their war against IS.
وش كمية كتير زوجي بون يعني من جيانا من ميزات كر متقول جرق أزوي كمان جيانا كم يعني شو بيكواز مالبات بي بحسن از تبلي نذهب ولا بون بشتي كواز تبلي نذهب ولا بون خيالي منه بتشكي هاتمي مجيان كر إشتا جنة كانت تشتكي بكي جنة كانت شعر بكي جنة كانت جدار في كاري هندر كاري دون بكي من يعني جبال هيرسي من هبو يعني عاجز بيني كمل هندري من هبو
For the Kurds, this is part of a wider battle, for a long-held dream of self-determination. Commander Son Huyn is part of that battle. Her nom de guerre means red blood. Today, Son Huyn commands around 1,000 fighters on the Raqqa front line. Periods of intense fighting punctuate the mundane routines of war. Together, these men and women make up the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, an alliance that includes Arabs but is led by the Kurds. We're heading towards the centre of Raqqa, Islamic State fighters are holed up in the old city, just a few hundred meters away. Everyone is on edge. A sound overhead signals the presence of an attack drone.
Well, what's happening? We've just driven down these narrow side streets and suddenly there's gunfire overhead and everyone's looking up in the sky, searching for these IS drones.
This is urban warfare. There are no real front lines. The Kurdish-led SDF are not on their own in this fight. The Americans have quietly built up a presence on the ground here in northern Syria, providing weapons, training and firepower. With US help, they've chased Islamic State out of traditionally Kurdish areas and beyond, expanding their control across the Euphrates and into mainly Arab territory to the west. This is Manbij. The Syrian Democratic Forces took the city last August, after 2.5 years under IS rule. This building was their courthouse. Here, Islamic State would sit in judgment over people they deemed to have broken their laws. Punishments would be meted out in the car park opposite. A local shopkeeper witnessed many of their gruesome executions. Even though IS is gone from here, he asked us not to reveal his identity for fear of reprisals.
الصلب بعد ما يقصوا العالم الصلب بعده بيومين يظلوا يومين صالبين يعني تطلع ريحة البني آدم ويصلبوه لحتى وما يدفنوه ما يعطوه لأهله يزتوه بغير إنه مطرعه بس ما تجيبه أي كلمة إذا بدك تشرب سيجارة بده يعني أصل لك أصبعك احتمال إذا صارت إذا بس 2 شهدوا عليك خلاص يعني بزتوا عالم من فوق الأوتيل هذا 5 طوابع بزتوه من فوق على الأرض وهيك شيء.
Down in the basement, their brutal legacy lingers like a ghost. In this dungeon, IS tortured its prisoners. A policeman showed us the cell where his uncle was kept. Barely big enough to contain a man, tiny air holes to keep him alive. When they let him out, after 4 days, they had to amputate his leg. In a vast graveyard in the centre of Manbij, IS fighters have smashed every single headstone. And even though Islamic State has been chased out of this town, that doesn't mean its ideology has gone with it.
شفنا ما يعني كسر القبور ايش القبور البني ادمين عم بتموت وقفت على الحجر البني ادمين ماتت وقفت على الحجرات والله صلاه وصيام والله وجماعه كافر والله الاولاد تشوف بالجوامع والله ما تشوف ولد فلتان ما تشوف ولد يتعاطى في بنت ما تشوف زلمه يتعاطى في مرأة.
In Manbij, a multi-ethnic military and civil council has brought life and stability back to this mainly Arab city under the auspices of the Kurdish-led SDF.
الوضع عندنا بفضل طبعا الديمقراطي حاليا كويس.
تمينا بيركين في البلد هون وتحملنا ظلم داعش وتحملنا مثل ما بيقولوا يعني القهر اللي كان موجود هون عندنا في البلد هون لحتى اجوا هون الاخوه الاكراد واجوا التحالف هون خلصونا من داعش.
The SDF and their American allies see Manbij as a template for Raqqa once IS is driven out. But in the context of Syria's ongoing civil war, it is, at best, a temporary arrangement. From Kobani to Manbij, and now to Raqqa, it has been a long road to the capital of the Caliphate. Commander Son Huin and her units are on the Western Front. It's a tight squeeze in a homemade armoured truck with a couple of her fighters driving towards the centre of Raqqa. Islamic State are supposed to be surrounded inside the old city. But IS have dug tunnels. And frequently they pop up where you don't expect them.
Well, these fighters, they're coming up against IS snipers in all of these streets around here. Other than that, they've got drones, they've got suicide carbines. This is going to be a very, very hard fight into the centre of Raqqa.
Back at base, Son Huin and her fellow commanders are having a strategy meeting. As the fight enters the narrow streets of the city, they're constantly having to adjust their tactics.
دروج بري تري أو نخون لزعيدي ذكر وكي فضاي خاكرنا حركاتي وقت كواتين أنجام نقرتن يعني تدبيري هفلا هبو هم جبوا عربيتها قماني وهم شي تدبيري هفلا حرالي ذهبوا يعني إنهم مرحلة كأم تيدانة مرحلة كي راستيجي استراتيجية جدية هم وكي مركز داعش وكي داعش خلص كرنا.
As the SDF push forward, Raqqa seems deserted. But the empty streets are deceptive. There are still people here, and they're desperate to get out. As we drive towards the centre, carts appear, flying white flags. There are still tens of thousands of people in Raqqa, trapped between the coalition airstrikes on one side and Islamic State on the other, who've been killing anyone who tries to flee.
يعني ما عاد نقدر نتحرك من البيوت. اللي قمنا ننزل على الماء قام يجي يطلق علينا بالماء. داعش انهزم يفجر حاله هنا وينهزم قاد يفجر حاله هنا وينهزم قاد. شي شغلته غير تفخيخ وخرب بيوت العالم. دحق البيت هذا اللي وراك. هذا بيتين مو حرام خربوه هيك. خربهم البلد كله.
The problem for the SDF coalition is this. They don't know whether some of those fleeing could in fact be IS supporters themselves. After screening, many of them end up at this camp. All have lived under the harsh regime of Islamic State. Not all against their will. Noor left Lebanon for Raqqa 2 years ago to join her husband, a jihadi. As the wife of a foreign fighter, Noor was in a relatively privileged position. There were many women, especially Yazidis, whose fates were much darker. Women captured and sold between the fighters as sex slaves. She saw all this.
صار كثير تحسسات بين الزوجة حتى صار في طلاق بين الزوج والزوجة بسبب السبايا صار هم يشتروا كثير سبايا ويصرفوا على السبايا كثير، يجيبوا لنا مكياج، يجيبوا لنا احلى لبس، يجيبوا لنا احلى اكسسوار، يجيبوا لنا احلى لباس ويلبسونا. وحتى كان انا زوجي القديم كان معه سوق للسبايا، هيك سوق للسبايا يعني تفوتي على التليجرام بتفوتي مجموعه اسمها سوق للسبايا، بيبعتوا صور السبايا، اذا هيك السبي بيبعتوا صورتها لابسه وعينها مكياج وهيك، اذا هيك السبي مثلا ب $2000، هيدي السبي $3000، هيدي السبيه بكر ومثلا $10000. انا كنت شوفها فيك مثلا مره اخر وحده وصلت بكر $30,000.
Those women are still there in Raqqa, prisoners of the caliphate. Syria has been at war for more than 6 years now, longer than the whole of World War II. The fight against Islamic State is but one facet of an ongoing conflict that is drawing in the world's big powers. From a hilltop overlooking the Manbij countryside, Roni Walat, a local Kurdish commander, showed me the point at which all these competing forces come face to face.
Okay, well, it's a pretty complicated picture, but basically I think it boils down to this. From the west, all the way up to the north, up to the Euphrates River over there, is controlled by the Americans. From that same western point, all the way to the south, is controlled by the Syrian regime. That describes a sort of D shape. In the middle of that is the pocket of the Manbij Military Council, which is an Arab-Kurdish coalition, but is basically controlled by the Kurds. But in between all of that, there's a Russian base just over there, an American base just 4 kilometers along from that, and surrounding all of it are FSA forces, Free Syrian Army, that are basically sponsored by the Turks.
For now, the battle against Islamic State provides a kind of common purpose. But once IS is gone, the potential for conflict between these big powers is very real.
اف توتر دبر روسيا داد نبرة تحالف ده زيدوية ذاتن اف شر بيونتي اخر شر ديجي ارهابي ديجي داعش شركة جهاني اساس دهات مشاندن تريك نافدا قطر نافدا بو روسيا نافدا رژیم نافدا ایران نافدا بگشتی جبلی شركة جهاني سمي ما نكاي بنافجي بكي.
The Kurds' position is extremely fragile. Their fighters belong to a branch of the PKK, considered a terrorist organisation by both Turkey and the United States. For now, the Syrian Kurds have the backing of the Americans, but Turkey, a NATO ally, carries out sporadic attacks against them. That's because their fight against the Islamic State is really about creating their own state. On the Raqqa front lines, Sonhuin's fighters are so close they can hear IS in the building across the street. For the Kurds, this is more than a war. It's a revolution. And it's attracting its share of idealistic outsiders.
There's just a million ways to die here. It's not just on a front. There is no front line, really. It's like a huge space of war that is like, even though it seems peaceful here, like anything can happen.
Kimmy Taylor is a former maths student. She's originally from Blackburn in the north of England. She left behind a life of activism at home to come to Syria to fight Islamic State.
What are the biggest worries? The biggest threats?
On the moving front, like where we're moving to take more space, it's snipers and mines. There's mines everywhere and there's snipers everywhere.
Are you scared?
No, there is something bigger than me. It's for people here, it's for women here and for women all in the Middle East and even maybe potentially the world.
In a conservative society, this feminist revolution faces internal opposition too. But this is a movement that tolerates little dissent. Political opponents have been jailed. Thousands of young people have fled conscription. But for Son Huyn, a true believer, The fight against IS is but one battle in a longer war to convert her own people to the cause.
هدفي تاني شهر جاكداري أنا بندرس برش مقطبو يعني دست بي كذا بابي خدا دست بي بكم ذهنيتك وصار جنيهاتي ما شغله ده الشخص الجنيه اللي صار بصاني فقير فقراء كاتي ما شغله بدي يجي مروباتي يعني بشت شهر جاكداري أنا دست بشهر ذهنيتك.
Sonhuin's fighters face Islamic State at perhaps its most dangerous. Wounded, cornered, and with nothing left to lose.
This is, of course, a battle for territory. They're fighting to take the capital of the caliphate. Oh, there's something happening here. Everyone's just springing into action. They think they've got some ISIS snipers in the buildings around.
Right. There's the piece of good.
We got one, yes?
Yes, let's go.
What's going on? Can you just tell me
They
what's...
are moving here. They are moving here.
The fall of the Islamic State is within sight. The question is, can this Kurdish revolution survive in the face of Syria's still unfinished war? Armoured truck with a couple of her fighters driving towards the centre of Raqqa. Islamic State are supposed to be surrounded inside the old city. But IS have dug tunnels. And frequently they pop up where you don't expect them.
Well, these fighters, they're coming up against IS snipers in all of these streets around here. Other than that, they've got drones, they've got suicide car bombs. This is going to be a very, very hard fight into the centre of Raqqa.
Back at base, Son Huyn and her fellow commanders are having a strategy meeting. As the fight enters the narrow streets of the city,
خمس طوابع بيزدون فوق على الأرض وهيك شيء.
down in the basement, their brutal legacy lingers like a ghost. In this dungeon, IS tortured its prisoners. A policeman showed us the cell where his uncle was kept. Barely big enough to contain a man, tiny air holes to keep him alive. When they let him out, after 4 days, they had to amputate his leg. In a vast graveyard in the centre of Manbij, IS fighters have smashed every single headstone.